Welcome to the exploration of consciousness.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the exploration of consciousness. I'm your host, Matt Presti. It's great to be back. Last week's guest was John Klezik, who wrote the book School World Order. Again, his website was schoolworldorder.info for more on him. Prior to that was Paul William Conant, who is a dehypnotist, and his work, of course, you can find that on Tech Podcast number 6, links to his work. And today's guest, I'm honored to welcome Mark Gober. His website is markgober.com, which I'll run here on the ticker. And Mark is a graduate of Princeton and a person who is basically 180'd in his academic view of consciousness. So welcome to the program, Mark. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Matt, thanks so much for having me.
And what's great about this is the reason I mentioned the two previous guests is because we're going to do a panel coming up in another month or so. And it's going to be a really cool question and answer panel where we tackle some of these issues of consciousness and how we can better get the word out about it. And so why don't you give us, to start for our listeners, just a little background on yourself and who is Mark Gober and how'd you get into conscious studies?
Sure. Well, I didn't start off being focused on consciousness. That came much later in my journey. So I'll take you back to the pre-consciousness era. Like you said, I went to Princeton. I was very much focused on achievements. So things that I could measure, succeeding in school. I was a competitive athlete. So I was one of the captains of the tennis team at Princeton. And before college, I was a junior national player. So I was in a very competitive type mindset. But all the while, I didn't have a sense of why life even mattered. I was just going about the motions and kind of being on a treadmill. That's what it felt like, where I would have a challenge in front of me and I wanted to achieve it. And maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But then I kind of went back to baseline. And because I didn't really have a sense of purpose or overarching vision to life, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated from Princeton. I decided to go into investment banking, which was what a lot of my classmates were doing. And I figured that would be a good platform if I wanted to have a business career. So I joined a large global investment bank in New York, starting in the summer of 2008, right after I graduated. So I ended up going into investment banking during the financial crisis, which was it's a tough field to begin with in terms of the hours and just the culture. But in that time of crisis, it was even more intense. So the good part of that is that it taught me that it wasn't what I wanted to do long term. So I ended up leaving the firm and I joined a group first in the Boston office, but I spent the majority of my time in Silicon Valley, about 10 years at this firm, advising companies on their technology strategy and their intellectual property. So somewhat related to what I did in New York, but a bit more intellectually stimulating. But in terms of like my existential way of looking at life, I was becoming more and more atheistic, agnostic, materialistic, the belief that there's no life after this body, the universe is random, there's no meaning built into the basic fabric of reality itself, a very nihilistic worldview. And I thought that's what science was teaching us. The more I just thought about things and the more I realized the implications of what I had been taught through the education system and through media as well, that was my baseline assumption about the nature of reality. And it wasn't something I would just talk about, but it was in the back of my mind in terms of how I thought about life. It's a very difficult way of looking at life long term, because if you don't think there's any meaning, it's harder and harder to handle the ups and downs. So in my professional life, there were some ups and downs. In my personal life, ups and downs, and they became harder and harder to tolerate. So I came to this point in 2014, 2015, where I wasn't tolerating the ups and downs as well. And I felt like I was just kind of on an aimless road where I didn't know what was next. I was continuing to be on this treadmill. And I started listening to podcasts in 2016. I wasn't looking for a new worldview. It was more just a hobby, and podcasts were becoming more popular at the time. I also had a long drive from San Francisco down to our office in Silicon Valley. And I stumbled across podcast that ended up talking about consciousness, where people were talking about what you might call the paranormal thing, mystical experiences that they were having. And these were people who had independent backgrounds. So they weren't people who necessarily knew each other. They had very diverse life experiences, and yet they were painting a picture of reality that totally contradicted my materialistic, nihilistic worldview. So I said, I need to investigate this. It wasn't like I had a flip overnight, but I wanted to research what was going on because I wanted to know if the people were just delusional. And if that were the case, then I wanted to understand why, whether they were lying or maybe there was some truth to it. And if there was any truth, then I realized the implications, which was that I would have to reconsider my life. So then I started to read books and scientific papers and realized there was a whole area of study that I had never been exposed to before. And it was from credible sources. Princeton had a lab for nearly 30 years run by the former dean of engineering. There's the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was founded by an Apollo 14 astronaut. I'm actually now on the board of that institute. The US government has done lots of work on consciousness. Those are just a few examples. But long story short, I had a major paradigm shift starting in 2016 when I was looking into this stuff, and it's continuing today. And it's led me on this path of wanting to understand the nature of reality, who we are, why we're here, what is this world that we're in. And it's led me to write now 5 books on a variety of topics on the nature of consciousness, but also spanning into the realm of politics and economics and applying principles of consciousness to our world. And I ended up leaving my firm actually. So actually right before everything with COVID hit, I had this sense in my body that I needed to make a change. And I was in a great spot professionally. I had become a partner at the firm, but decided I wanted to give myself space to explore these topics further. So I'm kind of in that space of being open, not really sure exactly what's next in my life, but I know what I'm passionate about. And I think the topics we're going to talk about today, Matt, are really fundamental for a paradigm shift globally.
That's great. That's great. Really appreciate that. I've got a follow-up question. Who was the astronaut?
Edgar Mitchell.
Of course. He's, I think, someone that's familiar with David William Gibbons, who did a platform and a show for quite a while, and might have been on that platform. So that rings close to home. And one thing you did mention in your presentation at the Cause Fest, which was a great event, met a lot of people. It's why we're having this conversation. Honestly, I've been looking to interview someone like you for more than 13 years. And so it's really a pleasure. I think we're going to connect a lot of dots because myself, as I explained prior to coming on the show, starting the show today, was that I tend to come to this from a mystical perspective. I've studied a lot of that for many years. I even scientifically explored psychedelics just to see what kinds of, I would say it's under controlled circumstances, but they were done alone in what Terence McKenna would term a heroic dose, 5
Wow.
dried grams of psilocybin cubensis. And only a number of times. I wasn't trying to, reach a godlike state, but rather a profound understanding of consciousness, sort of a hands-on answering of the great existential questions. But you mentioned that you had come across a podcast. And what was that podcast that altered your point of view?
The podcast is called Extreme Health Radio. So initially I was just listening for tips on alternative health. I thought it was really interesting. And it happened to be that the next episode in the queue one day, this was, I believe, August of 2016, was a woman named Laura Powers, who's now a friend of mine, and I've been on her podcast. But she was talking about her life experiences with psychic abilities and that she left her traditional career in higher education and she had a degree in political sciences. So kind of a mainstream person was talking about other dimensions of consciousness and helping clients with it on this alternative health show. I just remember being super intrigued. And then Laura, at the end of that episode on Extreme Health Radio, mentioned that she has a podcast called Healing Powers. So that was the one that I started to listen to, that I added to my podcast repertoire of just, this is something I hadn't heard of before. And she was interviewing person after person who had diverse experiences. Sometimes it was scientific, but often it was a personal mystical experience that I just was not familiar with this. And it was, I think, the accumulation of hearing different stories. It wasn't one episode. that totally flipped me. But as you're asking me about this, Matt, there's one that I do remember where I was incrementally more affected. And it's with a man named Paul Davids, who I actually ended up interviewing for my podcast called Where Is My Mind? Paul is a Princeton grad, and he worked in, he's a producer. So a Hollywood producer. The Transformers was one of the big things he worked on. And he started to have mystical experiences with one of his deceased colleagues. And he talked about things like an ink blot on a piece of paper when he was at home alone in his house in New Mexico. No one else was there. He left the room, came back, and there was wet ink on a piece of paper that he had been looking at that he didn't put there, and it blotched out certain words that had meaning. And he sent this ink blot to labs for 3 years that he paid for, and the scientists and the chemists couldn't figure out the composition. There were anomalies with it. That was one of many anomalies he started to have. And I just remember when I started to hear some of these experiences, it's like the implications of it hit home. I couldn't move. I was sitting in my chair and was like, wait a second. Is there more than meets the eye? And also, is there more to our consciousness than we can actually remember? Like, are there things that we know but don't even know that we know? And that just opens up an entire universe of possibilities.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I think this is going to be a really incredible talk. Couple more formalities. The Where's My Mind podcast, guys, you got to check that out. You can see that at markgober.com. Again, it's on the ticker there. And what's cool is you have a co-producer on that show by the name of Matt. Is Matt Davis? Am I right there?
Matt Ford from
Matt
Blue Duck
Ford.
Media.
Matt Ford. Okay. And you'd say Matt, and I'm listening to it, and I'm like, well, that's cool. I'm going to be having him on here in just the next few days. So it's kind of a little personal aside. But so yeah, that's a great thing, guys. Check it out again, markgober.com. And that is the Where's My Mind podcast. And to access your other podcasts with the Eben Alexander and Straussman and Schwartz, Sheldrake, etc., how do you do that? How do you get into?
Okay, I'll explain this because we did the podcast in a kind of unconventional manner. I
Mhm.
conducted about 50 interviews, and they're hour, 2 hours long, sort of like this long form discussions that I had.
Sure.
But the main event of it is on Apple Podcast and Spotify for free, where it's me talking to my friend and producer, Matt, and we're having a conversation and we splice in little clips from those much longer interviews. So the free version is that 8-episode series, the narrative, where it's clips of the interviews. And we decided to make all the full length interviews available for a one-time fee. So it's a $33 subscription one time, and you can access all the interviews indefinitely. So that's on my website if you want to access the long form. We have 2 of the long forms available currently for free on my YouTube channel. So it's with Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a University of Virginia professor, and Daniel Brinkley, who is a near-death experience survivor. He had multiple near-death experiences. So if you want to get a glimpse of what those interviews are like, they're on YouTube for free. And if you like more, you can check out my website for the subscription.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Brinkley's work. Great guy.
Yeah.
So Eben Alexander, one of the interesting things about him being that, and what you did with your podcast too, and this is again the free version, but you covered a lot of the bases that basically tie these different experiences together that are sort of on the outskirts of academic interests, and yet you were able to sort of bring them all together. And some of these are near-death experience, psychic phenomena, remote viewing. I might be missing a few, but duality versus non-duality and such. Have you actually gone and looked more into mystical perspectives at this point?
Well, the podcast came out in 2019, and it was on the heels of my first book, Into Upside Down Thinking. So the podcast and the book are similar. The book it's more academic because it's going into all the details. The podcast is the quick version that we wanted to make. That's why I worked with the producer to try to get it out to more mainstream. My perspectives are, I would say, similar to what they were back then, but they've just evolved and they've become more nuanced. So I've looked at more stuff. I have spent more time looking at what people have said from mystical traditions. It's something I don't feel like I'm well enough versed on, though. Like I know there's a lot more for me to understand, and I'm very interested in it, but I think I know more now than I did when we did the podcast a few years ago.
Certainly. Okay, well, that leaves us a good place to start here. I'm just going to throw out a few names of the people that I've studied who you could say it's sort of a mystical perspective, but the great Walter Russell, philosophy.org, H.W. Percival, who wrote Thinking and Destiny, Richard Morris Buck, who is an incredible, and I highly recommend this book to anybody studying consciousness, but Cosmic Consciousness, it's basically a term he came up with for someone who writes either highly inspired words or has that connection of non-dualistic experience, and so has translated it into their writings. Alexis Carrel, he wrote Man the Unknown. He advocated for a science of man, said we had all these great sciences, but we have no science of man, his mind, or soul. And so interestingly enough, that's what the University of Science and Philosophy actually teaches, about the only university in the world that Walter Russell and Leo Russell started together, which was a continuation of the Twilight Club, which was formed by Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Herbert Spencer, and Ralph Waldo Emerson and others, with backing from Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, back in the 1870s. And so that, of course, we have the writer, the author of the Bhagavad Gita, who is unknown, Lao Tzu, Manly P. Hall, Gurdjieff, Emerson, Khalil Gibran, Ken Wilber, William Blake, Carl Jung, Yogananda. So that's just basically a non-academic, mystical, hermetic, and alchemical list of folks that I've done some study into. And I think, but the beauty of what you've done again is you bringing into focus the academician side of this whole thing, and you're also challenging them, so that's a very wonderful thing to see, because it is a very rare thing these days. If you go against the grain, so to speak, it's like I told John Kleisik last week, you might lose your parking space,
Yeah.
So, but ultimately it's just a great thing to see, and it takes a little bit of bravery, I'm sure. And why don't we ask you a question about that? How did your colleagues take this when you started this process? And was anybody in academia like warning you against it, and did you meet with any resistance when you came out with this 180 that you did?
Let me take you back to where I was when I came out with my first material. I wrote the first draft of my book, my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, summer of 2017. So this was about a year after my initial exploration. And throughout that year, I had started to talk to a few friends about the research that I was doing, but I did not feel comfortable initially because I didn't know anyone in my network who had any familiarity with this stuff. I thought I was alone. Now I know there's a whole community of people. I mean, this is common knowledge to a lot of people. To me, in my little bubble, this was totally radical. So I was hesitant, and I would tell people, "Oh, I heard about this thing in quantum physics. Did you realize?" I was kind of tentatively throwing some studies at them that they'd never heard of, just over, having brunch with friends, that kind of thing. And people, for the most part, were really interested in it. They're like, "Wait a second. Well, if that's true, then I have to rethink my life." But then they would go about their business, whereas I was going back to studying. So this is the sort of thing, if you're going to get into it academically, it takes a lot of time. Whereas if you have a direct mystical experience, I found in talking to people, it can be a flip. Like overnight, there's a shift. Whereas the just the science-based method is more gradual, I found. So I learned a lot in talking to people about things and just kind of getting feedback on what was resonating, what wasn't. And it gave me enough confidence to write a book, because I felt like, wow, there's enough science here. And there's also enough of a need for a scientific book on this topic that I'm going to do it. So then I started talking more about to my work colleagues, because I was still working in business and I had clients and things like that. And it was the same kind of reaction where people were like, "Oh, okay. I mean, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it before," but I was coming at it from the scientific lens. So they weren't resisting it quite as much as they might have if I just threw out something that I thought was true. I will say there were some people who were skeptical and warned me against it. Uh, don't write this book, Mark. Don't do it. Uh, People with an academic background were, even when exposed to the evidence, people that I knew would completely reject it. They would come up with an excuse for why the studies were not valid. and that this was all hogwash that had been debunked before. And this was precisely the thing that I was trying to counteract with my writing. But that was the knee-jerk reaction of somehow it seemed to me that their ego was being challenged. Ego is part of it, maybe, meaning the pride of their worldview, but also the implications of what it would mean to have to redo a worldview and how disorienting that is, which I can relate to because it was incredibly disruptive to my life. So there are all these psychological factors that play into this, that I was seeing various reactions of the open-mindedness to the rejection to the partial open-mindedness, but not wanting to change their life. So they're like, I'm going to let you do this thing, Mark, but I'm not rejecting it, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. There's this whole spectrum that I've experienced. You're on mute, Matt. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's that's interesting because I imagine there's a lot, at least in the mind initially, you must think, it is sort of a I'm taking a risk here, right? Because you're coming out with what you think are opposing views to the very thing that you're, graduating from, and yet nature rewards courage, as it said, and mighty forces come to your aid. So you found that you met, a whole host of folks who have also been through academia, but also share those, the love for the mystery, if you will. And I think that's important. The Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world, they'll say such institutionalized things as only the consensus science matters.
Mhm.
We don't care what individuals think, but yet it's the individual who creates the very field of science itself by questioning the Catholic faith in the 15th and 16th centuries. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, it's quite the paradox that science has become its own form of religion, essentially. Some call it scientism,
Right.
where there is a worldview that science promotes, and it is promoted now in a dogmatic fashion, where evidence seems to be accepted and acceptable if it falls within a certain box. But if there's evidence that's outside that box, it is sometimes vehemently denied. So there's
Mhm.
a difference between skepticism and just plain debunking and just rejection. And I see that in the scientific community where, and I've talked to many scientists now that I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and Dr. Dean Radin is the chief scientist there. He's written many books. And I've now spoken to many people who run the sorts of studies that have been challenged and been often rejected just on the basis of the subject matter. They'll tell me things like, so one example, a woman who was uh, doing, let's say, search looking at anomalies in consciousness at a mainstream institution, mainstream university, was told to take the research off her resume if she wanted to get tenure. That's
Wow.
pretty insane. I've heard from scientists that they will do controlled double-blind studies, the standards that you would expect in other areas of science, but in the realm of the paranormal. They'll submit the papers to scientific journals, and sometimes the journals will reject the paper on the basis of the material covered, not on the basis of how the science was conducted.
Of
But
the
it's just,
merit.
it's just, well, this is not in the realm of science, of the sort of thing that we want to cover. We're going to reject it. We're not going to cover this material. So you end up with almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where certain things are reinforced in the scientific machinery, and then other things are not covered as much, so they don't get as much airtime, and therefore they're perceived as being more fringe, and they don't get as much funding. And it's this cycle where certain things are promoted and they get traction and others don't.
That's a good way to explain it, indeed. And that brings us to, well, you sent a list of topics that I'm really looking forward to delving into. The first on the list was the relationship between brain and consciousness. And I think this is fascinating because in speaking to what you were just talking about, how, the standards in science and in universities as to what somebody can list, for not only that, but for applying for grants and that kind of thing, you're very limited, but it brings us to that hard problem of consciousness that they talk about. And I like to say it's a hard problem because they materialized consciousness, as in there must be some particle or chemical or something within the brain itself that creates this thing that we call consciousness, which from the materialist perspective is an effect of matter, meaning it's an emergent quality or quantity of the brain that can be measured. But if it is hard, and if you've made it hard, which is really the mistake, I think, you've basically reduced it as most of material science reduces all things to the nuts and bolts, which are parts and particles. And with like a Walter Russell, he prefers to say this is a mind wave universe. I think that's also something you find that is characteristic in idealism in general, is that mind is more of a causal factor and matter is an effect of that cause. So therein is a dualism in itself, the material universe and the mind universe, which is causal. And so this is an argument that's been raging probably for several centuries, perhaps. But the relationship between the brain and consciousness and the hard problem, when you look at it from a mystical perspective as being causal, it's almost perfectly in line with a lot of the things that you're saying, and which the fringe academicians, if you will, until it becomes mainstream, you'll always be a fringe, but at least somebody's doing it, right? Somebody's turning the spotlight or the telescope back on itself, looking back into the head, as they say. And one of the things you like to say in your interviews or your podcast shorts were, touch your arm, touch your neck or your chest. Now touch your mind. Where is it? So why don't you talk about that, the relationship between brain and consciousness, and some things that you've uncovered that have personally affected the way that you see it?
Well, I'll start with the definition of consciousness, which is a challenge because consciousness isn't physical. I can't point to it and show you what it is and describe it in that way. It's experiential. So I think about consciousness as the part of us that experiences. Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who's a philosopher I'm going to mention a bunch of times in this interview, he calls it that which experiences. So if we use that definition of consciousness, then what's a thought? A thought is something that arises within consciousness. So our consciousness is the part of us that even experiences the thought. It is the sense of being I. If I say that I am speaking to you, Matt, the I in that sentence is what I mean by consciousness. So that's hopefully a shortcut to something that is probably not definable with human language. These are approximations. And as I started to research in 2016, initially I was coming across these phenomena: telepathy, remote viewing, near-death experiences, mediumship. These were various phenomena that people were directly experiencing and scientists were looking at. But I realized that they all were related to one fundamental thing, which was consciousness and how consciousness interplays with the brain. And for me, this was something I'd never thought about because even back when I was at Princeton, my major was in psychology. I was actually in the economics department at first and then switched to psychology. And then I studied behavioral economics. So I wasn't studying consciousness in the way that I'm looking at it now, but I did have to take some neuroscience. And so my assumption about consciousness was, well, the reason that we have the capacity for experience is because of stuff happening in our skull. We have a brain and there's chemical and electrical activity, and then consciousness pops out of the brain. It's an epiphenomenon. It's a byproduct of brain activity. So it's almost taken for granted that that's the case. People, at least when I was looking at psychology in undergrad, that wasn't even being questioned. It was just trying to understand, well, what are the parts of the brain that are responsible for our conscious experience? And now I know there's a term for that. It's known as neural correlates of consciousness. The key word there is correlate. Why is that significant? Because we know that, let's say when someone gets in a car accident and damages the brain and maybe has memory loss, we can see, wow, the brain was damaged right here, and now they're having a memory loss. We can change the brain in a certain way, and then they have a very specific change in the way that they experience life. Their consciousness changes. We see those correlations. But I also remember from studying statistics in undergrad that there's a saying, correlation does not imply causation. What does that mean? Going back to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, he says, imagine that you have a fire. Firefighters show up. You have a larger fire. More firefighters show up. So there's a very strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that appear at the scene. And then he asks rhetorically, should we say that the firefighters caused the fire? Right? It's a silly question. But what the point is, just because two things are related to each other and they can be very closely related, we can't automatically conclude that one thing causes the other. And this is the flip. And this is why my books are all about upside down. Because what if it's not that the brain is producing consciousness, but the brain is actually processing consciousness from outside of it, meaning consciousness is not localized to the body or to the brain, but the brain is, one analogy, this is not precise, is that the brain's like an antenna that's receiving and transmitting and transducing consciousness. So imagine if you had a television set with an antenna on it and you're watching TV, and then you take a hammer to it and smash the antenna. All of a sudden, this TV show is not appearing on your screen clearly. It's just a scratchy screen. The signal that the antenna was picking up has not been damaged. All that's been damaged is the apparatus responsible for processing the signal. So the analogy there is like just the brain. When you damage the brain, that's why you have an alteration in consciousness. The analogy that I like more is that the brain is a filtering mechanism of consciousness, or it's like a blindfold. And when you get the brain out of the way, a broader, more expanded consciousness is experienced in many of the mystical states that you described, Matt.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the things I do want to share with you that I think might bridge, even for the listeners who are on either the academic side or come from a mystical perspective or a little of both, is a graphic that basically was inspired to me by Walter Russell. But he talks of a universal consciousness as much as most mystics do, reference this God being. And in particular, Russell said God could also be called mind, universal mind. But he also had other words for it: stillness, silence, the undivided, the sexless state of which is consciousness. It's basically an undivided condition. But he said that through the illuminations that he experienced, and it's also a dot you could connect with Paramahansa Yogananda, who experienced illumination. He called it the thousand suns in the mind. And basically, scientifically defined, Russell described it as an electric short circuit between the lobes of the brain, which produced a flash of light.
Hmm.
And this flash of light it's symbolized by the light bulb over the head, right? So literally it's you're catapulting yourself into this state. I have a 4-part series I did called Knowing the Creator 101. But when you read like a Walter Russell, and if you really want to make the Bible interesting, just replace the word God and Lord with the word consciousness, and it takes on a whole new meaning. Fascinating indeed. But real quick, just to share a graphic with you, and this is what Russell describes as the universal mind, and what a Bernardo Kastrup would say is the each of us are little whirlpools in this big ocean, right, of still water. But this is, let me see if I can get the window here. Bear with me. So yeah, if you were to take a picture of space, of galaxies, and invert it, you would see that the black of space is turned to white. And so now you can picture, this is basically what I call a God selfie, a selfie of God. But that's your field. And so there's your little whirlpools, right? And something as simple as an inversion, that explains how consciousness is everywhere. It's in each one of us, and we're moving on that screen of space, centering every cell and bounding it through wave fields, which is what the beauty of Russell was, that he put the creator back into science back in the 1920s with his book, The Universal One. But ultimately, what he was trying to do was bring science and religion into a marriage to unify it so that they were no longer opposed with each other. But that's just one fascinating picture that I think sort of, reaffirms Kastrup's view as well. And I think little graphics like that can help to bridge the gaps between our understanding. And that's something really cool that I think can move mankind forward. But I did want to bring up a couple points on Kastrup. I watched a couple different presentations he did, and he talked about boundary equaling body, and that the inside outsider who has opposing views to mainstream science regarding consciousness, parts of something are not explanations of the boundary. The boundary of the body is that which is always overlooked, forsaking it for the parts of which it is made. That which looks to the outside does so from the inside.
Mm.
So he's another just fascinating mind who I think, you get guys like that in a room together with like a Russell, if he was still alive, what would the outcome be? Fascinating to say the least. But you want to discuss Bernardo Kastrup and his whirlpool analogy a little bit?
Sure. And let me just take a step back and explain where his work has fit into my personal evolution. Because my shift from what we would call materialist science or physicalist science, the belief that consciousness comes from the brain, which I don't believe to be true anymore. And just quickly, the implication, if you believe that consciousness comes from the brain, that means when your body dies, there's no consciousness because consciousness was created by the body. So big implications with what we're talking about here. There are 4 categories of things that have swayed me. One is consciousness anomalies, and that's what I focus on in Where is My Mind and in Into Upside Down Thinking. Quantum physics, it doesn't prove it, but it definitely challenges materialism. Direct experiences, and this is what you focused on a lot, Matt, I think is the mystical realm where people directly have this experience all over the world, throughout different traditions, all over time. Very powerful for me to have that evidence. Anecdotal, but very powerful. And the fourth is philosophy. And this is where Kastrup comes in. And it helped tip me over the edge because he makes the case that a consciousness-centric metaphysics versus a material-centric metaphysics philosophically is superior. So he takes a purely academic road on this. He's not even looking at from a personal mystical experience, even though he's open to that. He's saying if you take Occam's razor, which is that the simplest solution is usually the best, the consciousness-centric version beats the material-centric version because you don't need to make as many assumptions to explain reality. And this is a very complex topic that took me a while to get my mind around, but I think it's worth mentioning it to you and your audience because this is essential. The idea that there is a world, a physical world that exists independently of and outside of consciousness. Could that be true? It's possible. And that's what mainstream science would say. There was a material world, then there was all this evolution of a biological organism, and then consciousness pops out at the end. That's the materialistic train. It implies there was a world first that is unverifiable. Why? Because consciousness is required to register the verification. You'll think of that. That takes some time to think about. But basically, that's the key, is that we can't verify anything outside of consciousness. It could exist, but you could never prove it. Whereas consciousness, we know that is true by virtue of our own experience. We can't deny it because if we didn't have consciousness, we wouldn't be able to ask it. And there's a lot more that Kastrup goes into. He's written lots of peer-reviewed papers. He has a book called The Idea of the World, which is his accumulation of peer-reviewed papers. And he puts them all in one place explaining this idea. But he also wrote another one, going back to your initial question, Matt, called Why Materialism is Baloney. And he lays out this framework that's an alternative to materialism, which is that everything is consciousness, including matter, by the way. Our perception of matter is actually just a modulation of consciousness. Matter doesn't exist independently. So we call it matter, we call it out there, but it's actually not external. It's just the way we're perceiving through our consciousness. He says all reality is this one universal consciousness. But the reason that there seem to be these individuals of Mark and Matt and every person and every other conscious being is that we are like individuations, localizations within the broader consciousness. He calls it whirlpools within a stream of consciousness. So that explains why if there's one consciousness, it feels like we're interpreting the same world because we're part of the same consciousness, but we're effectively just interpreting it through different whirlpool lenses. And the key here is that this metaphysics, which I would say is my best approximation for how I look at reality personally, it enables both individuality and interconnectedness at the same time, that we can be separate, but then at a deeper level of reality, there's the oneness that all the mystics talk about and have experienced.
You discussed telekinesis as well, and clairvoyance. The similarities that twins experience. And I have a set of twins myself, fraternal twins. They're 25 years old. And I know I've heard from them that there's certain times in life where they've experienced these anomalies. What has your research shown for you that you've been able to uncover that confirms this sort of, you know, this connection between twins? I'm just interested, you know, and I know you've done some accumulating of facts in that regard, but having twins myself, it's an interest to hear what interesting things you might have discovered along the way with that.
I'm going back to my first book because that's where I focused on this topic. And there's a book that I referenced called Twin Telepathy. And I believe the author is named Guy Playfair, where he studied this. He looked at twins and looked at the paranormal things that happen between them, where twins can be far apart physically, but then they know when the other is in danger.
Mm,
Other humans have this as well, but there seems to be something about telepathy and interconnectedness that is related to emotional closeness. So this is my hypothesis that there's something about the emotional bond of the twins, maybe that connects them in a unique way that makes them, that heightens their innate telepathy. And then if we want to throw in genetics, because this is something that the Institute of Noetic Sciences has looked at a little bit as well, is there a relationship between how psychic we are and maybe even the way in which we're psychic and our genetics? So if you have two twins that have such a similar makeup, because when in the environment, I guess there can be mutations and things like that. So it's not always identical. I believe this is true after birth. If you have identical twins, they might have identical genetics, but then it can change over time as environmental factors. But they have very similar genetics. They might have a similar way of attuning to psychic things. So maybe it's the combination of their genetics and their emotional closeness that heightens the innate telepathy.
mhm. I'd have to think too, they're being in such close proximity, and I believe there's you know, being carried in the one womb of
Mm.
one mother for that period of time probably gave them a interesting connection as well.
You're also reminding me, Matt, there's something known as telesomatic events where if I hope I'm getting this right, if one twin is injured, the other one might have a pain. So they
Mm,
they will literally feel. It's not just, that's why it's telesomatic. There's a feeling, not just a knowing. And that's, I mean, the implications of that are so wild that there can be a physical effect of something at a distance. And this is why Dr. Dean Radin wrote a book called Entangled Minds, looking at the notion of quantum entanglement, which is the idea that two particles that are physically separate from each other in terms of space and time as well, if you alter one, the other one that's far away is altered at the same exact instant. This is a known scientific finding that Albert Einstein tried to disprove because he thought it was spooky. It challenged his idea that the speed of light is the fastest that anything can travel, because here entanglement shows an instantaneous connection. There's nothing traveling, it's just happening at the same time. So what is the relationship between quantum entanglement, part of the fabric of our reality and our mathematics, really? How does that relate to what we sense? Maybe there's a connection there.
yeah, that's fascinating. It seems to me that, you know, the materialist scientific paradigm is one that should have relented by now. It should have tapped out on the mat, right? Because
Yeah.
it's pinned basically, and you have the whole field of quantum, which what you're talking about, the entanglement and things of that nature, dual slit, other things. You know, why hasn't it relented yet and embraced more of a, you know, it's almost as if there's a need to have it figured out, but their theories are so incredibly complex. And then once they discover this small particle or this, you know, Higgs boson, then there's 10 more particles that precede that, which require even further. It's as if they're, the Walter Russells of the world would say, science has become so utterly complex that nobody but those in the deepest realm of it can even understand it.
Hmm.
And it's often said too by a lot of different mystical minds that if you can't explain the universe to a 7-year-old, you're in the wrong business, or you should at least look at changing your formulas at least. But where do you think this? When is this thing going to eventually start to embrace these more other or outer views as opposed to just protecting the inner views? And I was on a podcast recently, and the host said, no matter what, it seems that academia, it just continues on, even though it's been proven wrong time and time again by these outsiders who eventually, either they were an insider at once and came back from the outside with new information, but it's never embraced. How is it that they keep going and never changing their view? It's like they're bulletproof, like they're untouchable. But what do you see as far as the current state of materialist science? Is there, this being that you're on this fringe, you're on the outside, do you see an interest? Do you forecast an interest? And how long do you think this thing will have to go before it begins to embrace these ideas, at least for as considerations for new possibilities?
Part of me is pessimistic and part of me is optimistic. So I'll start with the pessimism, then I'll move to the optimism.
Gotcha.
Pessimism is, I'll give you an example. This is very telling. An interview on the Skeptico podcast with Dr. Mario Beauregard. This was in 2022, I believe. It's fairly recent. Mario Beauregard is a neuroscientist who studies spiritual phenomena. So he's a very brave scientist who's questioning materialism with his science. And he said on that podcast that at the prominent neurological institute in Canada, he was told by the head of the organization that as long as this person is there, Dr. Beauregard would never be able to study the scientific nature of spiritual phenomena. So there are real forces somehow that are suppressing information, suppressing science. What Dr. Beauregard said in that interview is this is social engineering. And where my mind goes with that, and I know that many people theorize this, I can't prove it, but there would be an incentive if you had a dark agenda to want to suppress this information because it's very empowering to the individual and to the masses, because the suggestion is that each of us is a whirlpool that has this innate consciousness, this innate connection to the whole. You might call that God, source, that it is within. It's not just external. There's David Hawkins called this, he said, God is both immanent within and transcendent beyond, that it's both. That is a profound idea that would potentially challenge power authorities. So I'll put that there as the pessimistic side. There are forces that are seeming to suppress this. And when I got into this stuff and wrote the first book of the draft in 2017, I was so enthusiastic. I'm like, the science is all here. It's going to happen. Like if people are just rational and see the science, we're going to get there. And I'm only seeing it happen incrementally. So part of me thinks it's going to take a while. On the optimistic side, when I talk to scientists who are more on the fringe, to me, it's not fringe, but relative to academia fringe, they say all the time that they will hear from mainstream scientists and academics who will tell them in private that they're very interested and they're supportive of the work, but they can't talk about it publicly. So it means that people on the inside are waking up. And Dean Radin did a study on this, that even mainstream academics have had mystical experiences that they can't explain, whether it's a telepathic event, precognitive event, the precognitive dream where they know or sense something that happens before it does, which puts into question all sorts of things. Maybe they feel like they connected with a deceased loved one where there was something mystical that happened. People have these experiences directly. So that's, to me, a cause for optimism. But even within the realm of traditional academia and peer-reviewed science, there are some papers that are making it through. And I told you before that there are cases where the papers get rejected just on the face of the subject matter, but some are getting through. One is a paper that I mention a bunch in the podcast, Where is My Mind? And I mention it, I think, in all my books. Dr. Etzel Cardenia from Lund University in Sweden, he published a paper in 2018 that made it through the peer-reviewed process at American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. And he accumulated the statistical evidence for a wide variety of psychic phenomena over many decades by many experimenters and showed that statistically they are real. And it made it through. This is a published paper. That's one. Another is a paper published by researchers at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in September of 2022. It was published in Frontiers in Psychology. And it talks about challenges to the materialistic or physicalist view of the brain. And so they talk about this, that the idea that there is a challenge to it. And last time I checked, there were like over 30,000 views of this paper. And the scientists tell me that's a very big deal, meaning that this is getting attention. So I think there's something in the air, but ultimately my hope is that this is going to have to be grassroots, like the work that you're doing, Matt, getting the word out there. It's going to have to come from that. And then the people are basically going to have to change. And then the institutions might have no choice if the people have their own paradigm shift.
It's like we need to create a shirt or a poster to put up in the halls of academia that says, "Don't leave consciousness at the door." You know,
Yeah.
so let's welcome it in finally after all these centuries. So yeah, it's really fascinating, the relationship between the brain and consciousness. And again, I have to come back to a Walter Russell who says, you know, that bodies are actually within consciousness. Consciousness isn't within bodies. And that's again this mystical perspective. Lao Tzu would agree with his, and that basically all mystics speak the same language, only the words vary. So what Russell was for me personally was like he taught me how to translate the words of all mystics into word and understand basically what I call a human Rosetta Stone,
Mhm.
at least for the studies of mysticism. But such fascinating things that, you know, I wish I could have gotten these guys in a room together and hear what comes out of the other end, or have been a fly on the wall in his discussions with Nikola Tesla as they were friends back in the day. But so the brain and consciousness, this will lead us into evidence for psychic phenomena. What did you find in your work and what you pieced together with psychic phenomena and how that relates to consciousness? What are your most intense findings?
My initial reaction to your question is because there were so many findings that I came across, but the US government's work on remote viewing, that was
Mm,
particularly powerful to me. Remote viewing is the ability to perceive something with the mind alone that is far away in space and time. So, psychic spying, that's what the government was doing. And there are declassified documents. So, when we were in
mhm,
Tennessee, Matt, I put up some of those declassified documents on the screen. They say, direct quote, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. This is public
mhm,
information that is now out there. The government's program ran from the 70s into the mid 90s, and it was led by Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. Russell Targ is one of the scientists that I interviewed for my podcast, Where Is My Mind? And I've talked to other people that have been around the program, to people who are been involved in it. Of course, remote viewing was real. There's no question about it. But then it's been spun into different ways, and the media and Wikipedia will say, well, it was never found to be useful. There's some kind of suppression going on because if you look at the documents themselves, they're very clear about the fact that it was used. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter even confirmed that remote viewers were used to find a downed Russian bomber that was lost in an African jungle. So no one
mhm.
knew where it was, and the radar systems couldn't find it. So they used these
Right.
psychics. Uh, that was very powerful to me. And then in 1995, there were hearings about the remote viewing project, apparently. And Dr. Jessica Utz, who in 2016 was the president of the American Statistical Association, so a statistics professor from UC Davis, looked at all the findings, not just the US government program stuff, but all lab work like done at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Princeton's lab that I mentioned before. It's called the PAIR Lab. Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, which actually was going on while I was an undergrad. It concluded in 2007, run by the dean of engineering, studying this stuff scientifically and statistically. Dr. Jessica Utz, the statistician, she wrote in 1995, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. Talking statistically speaking, that means that it doesn't mean that every human being is 100% psychic 100% of the time. What it means is that people, beyond what chance would predict, seem to be able to know things that they should not be able to know through ordinary means.
It's very interesting. And you mentioned Uri Geller too. You did interview him, is that right?
Yes, I did.
What was do you think, share something with us that came out of that interview that might have blown your socks off? Because he's
He's
an interesting person.
Yeah, fascinating guy to talk to. He is famous for his alleged ability to bend spoons with his mind, and then he went on the the Carson show, the Carson late night show
Mhm.
a long time ago, and he didn't do it. And people, Johnny Carson, and then people say that like he's just a fraud. But then there are lots of other people that say he was able to do it. Um, in my first book, An End Upside Down Thinking, I show some of the documents that were released by the CIA that have been declassified that show the experiments done on him in terms of remote viewing, where he was locked in an electrically shielded room and asked to see something with his mind, and he was able to do it successfully. And I'm paraphrasing here, but that he was able to uh, he demonstrated his paranormal abilities in a clear manner. Something like that was the quote. I mean, clear and unambiguous manner. So most people who I've talked to who have been around him say that the guy was very psychic. And when I talk to people like him, I mean, there's just no doubt. That's the sense you get, that it's not like they're making it up. They're talking about their direct experiences with their life. He's also had experiences with UFOs, which is interesting because it's something else I've looked at and have written on. And he did have a mystical experience as a child. I'm not remembering exactly what he told me, but there was something that happened, and that is not an uncommon thing. There's a correlation between a mystical experience and psychic abilities. We see this also with near-death experiences. That there's a joke, if you go to a near-death experience survivor conference, you can tell which people had near-death experiences and which people were just observers or researchers by who's wearing a watch, because the people who had a near-death experience, electronics don't work around them. They have literal changes in their field, and they're more psychic. So this is something that is shown over and over again, and maybe Uri Geller is one example of that.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's a whole nother subject that you covered, that's what's so interesting. You took each thing and you kind of put it together and gave each subject matter some time to discuss and interviewed people based on that. And so, of course, near-death experiences is one of them. And I've done a lot of study into near-death experiences, probably read and studied over 1,000 cases. And this includes, we'll get to this in a little bit, but children who come back with birthmarks, things of that nature, who recall past lives. That's in relation to death, of course, because you cross over that threshold. Basically, from my mystical studies, I've concluded that consciousness doesn't die, obviously. It simply focuses into a new body, but it rests from motion with gaps in between it. And just like, who was it? Beethoven said, God is in the silence, in the space between the notes. And so that's, in a sense, that's saying the same thing, that rest and, rest in peace. We get these terms like this. So it's really the non-materiality of consciousness itself, which is that omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent force that, for lack of a better term, men have called God. But I think it's to the point where we're able to look at it with the magnifying glass and the telescope simultaneously and begin to, if we can mold and blend the mystic side of this with the academic side and have a real authentic questioning and, get people together to discuss and actually consider these implications, it could certainly change humanity, as your episode 8 podcast really brought and correlated and brought everything home in a solution-based sense, which we'll get to as well. But one of the people I've met, and I've actually, when I did a conference I worked as president for the University of Science and Philosophy for 7 years, and we did 2 or 3 homecomings, 3 homecomings actually. And one of our guest speakers was PMH Atwater, and she's done several books on near-death experiences, having some of her own. But one of the interesting things, and I just want to read this. Let me see if I can't get it up on the screen here. Stand by just a moment. My engineering, having to do this all myself. Be nice if I could afford a guy to come in and do this for me. But here we go. Basically, from what near-death experiencers, this is one of those, let me just say, a description of a number of things that Richard Morris Buck from his book Cosmic Consciousness put together. But it also mirrors the near-death experience, of which I've had 2 of my own. One was not as intense. The first one I had was absolutely intense, and I might get into that one day with my listeners. But basically what these folks bring back, which is also significantly descriptive of the illumination experience, is that number one, they sense a unity, a oneness, a wholeness, completeness, a moral elevation. The white light experience, number 2, or the subjective light. Number 3, a description of the experience as one of eternal peace or rest, undivided, formless, pure, and infinite love. Number 4, when they come back, a transfiguration of the individual as seen by others. Number 5, the instantaneousness and suddenness of the awakening. Number 6, new knowledge without learning. Number 7, God, source, or creator. And let me shift to this next one here. Number 8, immortality or loss of the fear of death and loss of the sense of sin or evil. And number 9, new life and vitality added, character, charm, self-healing, actualization, grand realizations, expansive intellectual capacities, incredible concepts followed by action in building them and giving them a body or form, which is typical of many great artists. So you mentioned Dannion Brinkley, and I think he put it home quite well in his ability to basically show how, you know, it completely transformed his life. But what's interesting is this illumination experience and these near-death experiences share a lot of these same things. Now, what the near-death experience does also is it in how it differs. What was I going to say about that? And how it differs from illumination is that it. What was I going to say? It was just on the tip of my tongue. You know, that happens. My consciousness just blipped for a second. But like Brinkley said, he experienced what it was like as a Vietnam War experiencer. He was a soldier. He did not only experience what it was like to do the things he did to other people, murder, death, killing, whatever it was, but he also experienced what it was like for that to be done to him. And interestingly enough, that says a lot about the consciousness and the conscious experience from that near-death perspective. But he also said that to the degree that you help others, like he became involved with hospice, and he also got to experience what it was like to be the receiver of his own help. And that really is just, that gives me chills when I think about that. We could go on about near death, but again, PMH Atwater and her work, and then it was Eben Alexander with his 25 years, you know, in study of this stuff. What'd you come out with on the other end of studying the near-death experiences that really rung home for you in terms of you know, what was most impressive about your studies into the near-death experiencers?
Well, I would say the study is ongoing because it's such a profound experience for people. And maybe what sticks for me most is the way in which people are transformed and the universality of that way. So these are people with different lives, and you hear them talk about their near-death experience. It is such a similar thing. Even though they didn't have necessarily an identical experience, they are transformed in a similar way. And that's why Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia, who I interviewed, he's a psychiatrist who studies near-death experiences. He's looking at not only what does this tell us about the brain and consciousness, but how is it changing people from a psychiatric lens? It's not just like a hallucination where it's just some kind of weird thing and then the memory goes away. People were experiencing something in these near-death states that are often realer than real life, and they change their life priorities. Often they get divorced, they change their job. You mentioned Dannion Brinkley, who was struck by lightning. He had open heart surgery twice, brain surgery once, had these elaborate near-death experiences. When he almost died, he's resuscitated and comes back and says, I had to relive my whole life. I became all the people that I impacted. When I was in war, when I was in Vietnam and I killed people, I became the people that I killed. I became the children who no longer had a father. I felt the indirect effects of my actions. So he said, I'm going to turn my life around, became a hospice volunteer. I mean, that's a big statement when people are literally changing what they do. So just as
180.
a 180. So as a rational person, I'm looking at this like, what could change someone so much? And how is this happening at a time when Dr. Bruce Grayson told me this in the podcast? He said, there's this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. How could that be? And how could it be having a real world effect on people? One more thing from Dr. Grayson. I didn't talk about this in the podcast, but this is a huge one. A 2010 paper he wrote on near-death experiences. There are people in the near-death state. They talk about encountering deceased relatives or even mystical beings, a being of light. Many people talk about this, but sometimes they encounter a person that they know who they didn't know died, and then they're resuscitated and find out the person died. Meaning that
Wow.
somehow the consciousness of the person, it's a verified memory, veridical case where they come back with information verified they could not have known about through any other means. And then they report information that way. So that is also powerful information that there is this other realm that the mystics talk about, but the near-death experiencers too. Our consciousness, when the body is not functioning, is going somewhere else that we don't see with our eyes.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Veridical, I love that term. Learned a new word listening to your podcast. So what I remembered what it was, it was actually a similarity between illuminations and near-death experiences is that they don't want to come back from it. So it's as if there's such a profound peace that they just, please don't send me back. And I felt the same way in mine. I was like, I don't want to go back to that place. That thing's it's a mess. But it was basically, you're not supposed to be here. Back you go. And I literally slammed back down in my body and came off the bed and landed back on, just a few inches. But it was so profound. I know that what people say in these experiences are absolutely incredible. One thing you mentioned too is the less brain, the more mind. Want to talk about that for just a little bit?
Yes. I want to, before I forget, there's an important point I want to make about near-death
Sure.
experiences first,
Mhm.
which is that people often come back and they remember certain things, like I was shown my purpose and I have a clearer sense of it, but they don't always remember everything. And I quote, there was a woman in my podcast, Barbara Bartolome, who had a near-death experience. She said something like, I knew that I knew, I know that I knew what my purpose was, but I don't remember exactly everything that was there. So not only is there the sense that people want to come back when they're in that, they don't want to come back in their body. They want to stay in the state. When they come back in their body, they don't have full access somehow. Like not all is revealed, at least in the physical form. We can't remember everything. So it's something I'm still trying to grapple with. Like, why is it that we don't remember everything? Separate topic. But less brain, more consciousness. This does relate to near-death experiences. It goes back to challenging correlation versus causation in the brain, because typically people say, well, you need a ton of brain activity to have a very complex consciousness. So near-death experience is a challenge to that. You have an enriched consciousness, realer than real, and little or no brain functioning. This is a pattern that I've started to call less brain, more consciousness. Dr. Bernardo Kastrup actually has an article in Scientific American, it's publicly available, called Transcending the Brain, I believe 2017, where he goes through example after example of this. Less brain, more consciousness. Another one is savant syndrome, which is a medically accepted phenomenon, a person who has extraordinary mental capacities. They might be a mathematical genius, incredible memory, incredible music
Real
abilities.
Rain Man. Yeah.
Rain Man. Yeah. The movie Dustin Hoffman was based off of a real person named Kim Peek, who has been studied, and incredible abilities. But you look at the brain is abnormal. There might be certain deficiencies. Less brain, more consciousness. One other example. I'll give two more actually. Psychedelics, there are emerging studies. We need more research on this, and it's been written about by Dr. Kastrup and also Dr. Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia in Scientific American, if your audience wants to go check it out. Psychedelic studies. Some interpret the findings to say that there are certain reductions in brain functioning happening when there's a psychedelic trip, an enriched consciousness of the psychedelic trip, and so the toning down of the brain. And last example, terminal lucidity. These are instances that hospice workers know about often because they're working with people who are close to the time of death. A person, let's say, has had Alzheimer's disease for years. So the brain is clearly damaged. They don't have memory. They don't remember things. And shortly before dying, they snap back into clarity and they start talking normally. So you've got a damaged brain and a normal consciousness. This pattern is anomalous because for materialism. because materialism says, no, 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 this shouldn't be happening. We need to have lots of brain functioning. And yet we have this other pattern, which is more aligned with the idea that the brain is a filtering mechanism. It's getting in the way. It's blindfolding us from something that if we just got the brain out of the way, we'd experience it more. And that's what I think the mystics are doing. Somehow they're getting their brain into a state, whether it's a near-death experience is extreme, but I think it can be achieved through meditation and other types of bodily practices where people are getting outside their whirlpool.
Mhm. To paraphrase Nikola Tesla's quote, "My brain is but a receiver for a greater universal intelligence." And that's how it, in his flashes, he saw the AC motor, the AC generator. So he had the complete picture in his mind. All he had to do was build it.
Hmm.
That's fascinating because when we talk about less brain, more mind, more consciousness, that's sort of in direct contradiction to the New Age movement idea of raising your vibration.
Hmm.
And
Point.
if you look at the mystics and the mystical writings, they all say similar things like you want to be like the still stream, you want to become still, be at rest, be silent, right? And stop your thinking. So when you think and you're thinking and you're doing gymnastics, let's say, or kung fu or whatever, that's a high vibration. A fever is a high vibration. So you want to actually, to get more clarity and more consciousness, you want to lower your vibration towards
Hmm.
stillness. And that's really what meditation is. So it's in direct contradiction with the New Age movement, which I did call out in my Knowing the Creator episode 2. But for my listeners, they know I'm all about critiquing, no matter what it is. If you
Yeah.
don't critique it, and that's what I implore all academicians to take examples from the John Clysigs of the world and the Mark Gobers of the world, because you can have an alternative view that's directly opposed to an institution that you graduated from. But having that view and being unafraid to embrace it, learn about it, and then present it is actually more of a help to the staunch, stalwart academic mindset than just not doing anything at all, because nothing will ever change if you don't find that courage to hold that mirror up to certain things, certain ideals. The one of the greatest things I think the human race falls into is this idea of permanence. And the mind itself is really a permanent function of humanity, because you can't even make a decision or an observation without a consciousness being involved with what it is that you're deciding about. Or so that in one sense, that permanence of mind is as being itself. And then you have scaffolding in that mind, which are religions, religious beliefs, scientific views that are unchangeable. Now, I've seen laws of physics broken, the second law of thermodynamics, for instance, or the Coulomb law. I've actually witnessed these things being broken. So how can they be laws?
Hmm.
And this is the very thing I'm talking about. If we're truly scientific, we have to be mutable to change, to embrace it, because that's the very essence and the core of a scientific mindset, which is that we don't know everything, right? And so if we think we know everything about consciousness, and I know these neuroscientists, they get together in their conventions and do they talk about these things? Are there any conventions? I know the Noetic Sciences, I'd love to learn more about that institute. But from your experience, are you seeing conferences that get together to talk about consciousness itself, other than within the Noetic Science group? Are you seeing this anywhere else? Any interest in this?
There is a conference, I believe it's called the Science of Consciousness, and it's led by the University of Arizona, Stuart Hameroff. I've never attended it, but I've seen some of the talks there, and it seems to be a good mix of people who are pushing the boundaries of non-local consciousness and then also more mainstream neuroscientists. So that's a good blend. So there's more talk about this, and even like Sam Harris, for example, he's a famous author and atheist philosopher. Uh, his wife wrote a book called Conscious, which challenges materialism. Now, she comes up with panpsychism, which Castro critiques very well.
Mhm.
The version of panpsychism that he calls it constitutive panpsychism, which is like, well, we can't explain how consciousness comes from the brain. We don't understand how that happens. So we're just going to say that every little tiny unit of matter has consciousness within it. And when you combine all those units of matter, then you get complex consciousness. It's
Mhm.
backdoor materialism. It's starting with matter and you end up with consciousness at the end.
That's a
So
good term.
yeah, it's not what we're talking about, which is the primacy of consciousness working through the material world and actually being the source of it. It's not
Mhm.
exactly constitutive panpsychism. But I mention it because this is Sam Harris's wife, and she's at least acknowledging that there are problems. And Sam Harris himself, he said in one of his books that there's nothing about a brain studied at any scale that suggests that it might harbor consciousness. That might be close to a direct quote. So even the mainstream people acknowledge that there is this hard problem. Um, and the hard problem, going back to our previous discussion, is how could it be that something non-physical like consciousness comes from something physical like a brain? And Science Magazine called this the number 2 question in all of science. The way they phrased it is, what is the biological basis of consciousness? In other words, they are presuming that there is a biological basis of consciousness, and that's why
Right.
I would argue they haven't answered it. Their number 1 question is, what is the universe made out of? And I think you would argue this as well, is that it is consciousness. So I mention all of that to say that there are questions, at least, that are coming up. They might not answer it in the way that you and I would agree with, but they're at least
Right.
asking the questions.
Well, coming at it backwards, you could say it's like having the Mona Lisa, and you're examining it and you're trying to find Leonardo in the drops of paint. There must be this creator of this painting. It's got to be in the paint. It's got to be in the frame. It must be on the canvas. But they're not seeing that the painting is not the painter. The poem is not the poet. The musical composition is not the composer. So these are representations of mind creations, which is, again, I have to give the credit for that statement to Walter Russell, who he just makes you think about things from 180 degrees throughout his entire cosmogony. And you mentioned atheism. It brought to mind a quote by Rupert Sheldrake: "The kind of God most atheists don't believe in is the kind of God most theists don't believe in either."
That's right. That's right. And I remember this from my atheistic days. One of my favorite books was The God Delusion by Richard
Mhm.
Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins. Yeah.
And in that book, he critiques things that I think I still would critique, actually. He's critiquing the anthropomorphized version of a separate God that is genocidal and
Mhm.
jealous,
Right.
and a sort of a projection of a type of a human, or it sounds like a living being. What we're talking about here today is a different thing. We're talking about a source of interconnectivity that in many ways is impersonal. So it's the term God has so many different meanings. I hesitate to use it because depending on who you talk to, they have a certain uh, bias toward it. I tend to think of w- I'm looking at it from what is like a bottom up approach. What's the nature of reality? And the answer to me, the best I can come up with, is an interconnected consciousness that is the source of everything, that is beyond space and time, that is intelligent. And that's what I think of, rather than the anthropomorphized version of a powerful being.
Absolutely, because you're materializing, which is more or less idolatry,
Mhm.
you could say. And as long as you're materializing this God, if you understand God to be consciousness, like I was saying in the beginning, read the Bible and replace the word God with consciousness, and it takes on a whole new meaning. But that materialization of, which is also anthropomorphization, you could say, or taking the bigger, and as in a hermetic axiom, as above so below, you're taking the cycles of the planets and the stars, and you're making them into human stories.
Hmm.
Solar myths, as Kersey Graves wrote, The 16 Saviors Before Christ, back in the 20s, talks about the solarization. It's a solar myth that was applied to 16 different human beings, but they didn't actually possess that miraculous nature that was laid onto them by the traversing of the sun from basically astronomy and astrology. Like Jesus walking on water, if the sun is the Christ, the sun, it reflects on water and walks across it. It's also healing. It can also turn water into wine, which is, it makes the grapes grow. it's the source. So there's wonderful ways to interpret, what is consciousness. And it's fascinating too to know that, with the Sheldrakes out there. Give me a little bit of background on your interview with Rupert, and what did he impart to you that was special that you recall?
Rupert Sheldrake is a former Cambridge biochemist who has been, like many scientists in this area, who are, in my view, heroes and very courageous. He's been maligned by various skeptics, and if you go to his Wikipedia page, at least last time I checked, it says he's a pseudoscientist, or he performs
Mm,
pseudoscience, and his Wikipedia page is semi-protected, which means you can't edit it in the normal way. So it's like it's locked in there. And if you're a normal person who doesn't know much about this, and you just like Google his name and you see, oh, he's a pseudoscientist, it's an easy way to dismiss somebody,
sure.
unfortunately. But in any event, I think he's done really important work on telepathy. So he's done some studies on telephone telepathy, where people seem to like think of someone and then the person texts them. That's a phenomenon that many
Mhm.
people have talked about, and you can study that sort of thing. He's also looked at the sense of being stared at, which has been reported in all sorts of professions, but also cultures all over the world. You can test that sort of thing. You can have a person looking at someone through a camera or not, and you can ask that person who's in the room whether they thought they were being stared at or not. And he's tested this stuff scientifically. But I think where he's gotten the most press and the most criticism is around his work on animals and psychic abilities. In particular, the idea that dogs know when their owners are coming home.
Right.
And if your audience is interested, you can go to his website. He has a video of one of the studies where he sends the owner, a dog owner who claims to have the psychic connection with their dog, far away from home. So miles away at a randomly selected time, not in her own vehicle, with an experimenter, and the experimenter is just hanging out with the dog owner far away from home. And okay, at a randomly selected time, now you're gonna go and walk to the cab, and the cab's gonna take you home. Sheldrake had a camera on the dog at home during this entire period to see, does the dog go to the window to wait for the owner when the owner's on the way home? And what he found is that when the owner even has the intention of walking to the cab miles away from home at a randomly selected time, so it's not even the normal car, um, the dog walks over to the window beyond what chance would predict, statistically speaking, which is suggestive of a psychic knowing, almost like telepathic twins, that there's an emotional bond between animal and human, which many pet owners have claimed, but he's looked at it scientifically.
That's fascinating. Was there actual percentage given for what his results came out
I
to?
don't recall what the exact number is, but there are papers on this, and there were skeptics. There was a whole feud that he talks about in his book. I believe it's called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and Other Phenomena Related to Animals, because he's looked at other animal studies too and other psychic phenomena. But there was a feud with skeptics who he felt twisted the data or didn't. They tried to replicate it. I don't want to say because I don't remember exactly what it was. I wrote about this in my book, but they did. I think they did damage to his reputation because people said, "Oh well, the skeptics tried and they weren't able to replicate it." But this more complicated than that.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna have to make a conference where we can all get together and invite Rupert and all these great minds and just come on down to Virginia University of Science and Philosophy. We'll do a conference. You be a guest speaker too, and we'll have some panels. I think that would be fantastic. Let's look at that for next year.
Yeah.
All right. Duality versus non-duality. Now, I like people that follow me on Telegram, follow my work. I've written articles on this, multiple articles about what I call the center or the fulcrum of your own being, which is the undivided line between your two hemispheres. And I like to say there's something called horizontal thinking, which moves on that fulcrum like a seesaw, but your consciousness is literally that fulcrum. It does center every cell and corpuscle of your body, but also bounds your body. And when you become one, you're fusing the two hemispheres and you're turning your awareness vertical. And that's when what Russell would say, again, I've got to quote the source. He would say that's what genius does. It turns itself vertical and then commands the body to express and crystallize its thoughts into artistic forms or creative, outlets and such. It could be called focusing. People call it in sports, they call it the zone, when you're in the zone, you can do these
Mhm.
amazing things like score 89 points in one game or something. It's just you're in the zone when you've got that vertical awareness, and you're extremely balanced at that point. But your production goes off the charts too. You're able to literally tap that source of power within yourself, which is that motivating force that we can only call God or mind or stillness, silence, equilibrium, balance. But it all is the same thing, really. It's synonymous. And that duality versus the non-duality, what you find in the geniuses among men is an ability to basically, they don't get fatigued, they produce prodigious amounts of work, and they get more incredibly, let's just say, they become more profound and even more incredible with age, unlike, say, a mediocrity or mediocre human who, let let me just quote again. Excuse me. Walter Russell said, mediocre men begin to die at 40, great men come alive at 40.
Mm.
And so with the genius, the mind just becomes more and more incredible and profound, like a Leonardo da Vinci, or you could take a, Nikola Tesla. I mean, it's not like most men are not geniuses, but we all have the seed of it within us. And so this nurturing really is what I would say is that non-duality, that expression of that innate power within each one of us. It's just expressed to a greater degree than someone who doesn't express it, but that's ultimately a choice. But with your study of duality versus non-duality, what have you found, and what are the interesting points that you'd like to share with us on that?
I'm really glad you brought this up because it is one of the areas where my thinking is continuing to evolve, trying to reconcile paradoxes here. What I mean by non-duality, and this is a term from Advaita Vedanta, it's the notion that there is not two, there is just one reality, there's just oneness. And yet, in our everyday experience, that does not appear to be the case, that there is separation. And the way that I reconcile it, and I've heard others do this too, is that it is a paradox that just these two things coexist, the appearance of individuality within unity, that they coexist at the same time. We are one, we are not separate, and we are separate. I'm emphasizing this because one of my biggest criticisms of a lot of the modern spiritual movement is that it gets too caught up in the non-dual, applying it to a dualistic world. What do I mean by that? I'll hear some people say things like, there is no evil. And at one level of reality, I agree. I do think the basis of reality is a universal consciousness that is made of unconditional love, because that is what the research and the data seems to suggest over and over again. But again, we're dealing with paradox here. There is duality where there is dark and light. There is me and you within the unity. So it's like applying non-duality to duality can be dangerous if it's not done carefully, because then it can lead people to ignore the basic realities of our world. And to me, there is evil and there is darkness within duality, even though it's within the context of unity.
That's a great point. And two, you mentioned in your talk in Franklin, Tennessee, about compassion
Hmm.
and the dangerous side of compassion. Would you care to touch on that?
Yeah, again, I'm thank you for bringing that up. This has
Mhm.
been top of mind for me, because I want to take you through my journey, because maybe some of your audience members can relate to this. Started off like atheistic, right? And then I saw, wow, consciousness doesn't come from the brain. We survive bodily death. We're all one. There's a unity to that. And that was my primary orientation with things. And I left my job. I had written my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, which talks about just my own transformation in life, but also applying just general approaches to living life. And in that book, one of the 10 approaches that I talk about is compassion with discernment. And that was my initial attempt. Maybe it was like my own precognition of what I was going to become more interested in. Compassion with discernment. Why compassion? Well, talk to anyone who's had a mystical experience or who's had a life review. They will say the golden rule is built into the fabric of reality itself. Treat people well because they are you at some level. So compassion totally makes sense to me.
Mhm.
Why do I say discernment? because we do live in a dualistic world where there is a variety of things. And I mentioned in that book a woman who had a spiritual awakening, had a mystical experience. She was feeling unconditional love, like in a totally awakened state toward everyone. She met a man, let the man into her home for 6 months, and she said, "He manipulated me. My life was hell. I couldn't discern." So here she was being so compassionate. She was following the principles of non duality, and it didn't work in the world in which we operate. So this is where I think there's this balance. Compassion, okay, yes, acknowledge the unity, but then also acknowledge that we live in duality and we have to be wary of appearances because appearances are not always what's beneath the surface. You can't always judge a book by its cover, for example. And that's really kind of the underlying theme of my later work on politics and the World Economic Forum's Great Reset is like, how can we apply non-dual principles to a dualistic world? And it requires having this balance of it's almost like returning to the mystical state and then holding it while appreciating duality. That's my tentative way of looking at it. But this is key somehow. And I think the mystics are focused on this from what I've seen. It's like, how do you embody in the physical world that which is transcendent?
That's wonderfully said. And Walter Russell calls this light of mind. He says there's one law for it, and that's the law of balance. And if you need 2 words, rhythmic balanced. If you need 3 words, let them be rhythmic balanced interchange. And I like to say of that, my own adage is we have 3 primary charges in life. Number 1, learn to access that light of balance within ourselves. Number 2, learn to express it. But over all of those, the third and most important is learn to hold it. And that's really, I think you're saying the same thing. It's beautifully said. The evidence that we are not alone, for example, non-human intelligences. Now, this is going to be a great little section here because I've got a little thing to read about AI, but we can talk about that. And what's your opinions on AI?
Sure. Well, I'll start with AI and then we can move into not being alone. But because AI is that's a hot topic these days and it
It is.
relates to consciousness because the mainstream materialistic view is that, well, the consciousness just comes from the brain and the brain's a big biological computer. So if we could just if we can mimic the computational ability of a brain, then we'd be able to create new consciousness. And what I don't agree with on that is that I don't think consciousness comes from matter. So I don't think we'll create new consciousness through a computer. We could create something that's very intelligent, but it's not going to have that sense of experiencing. It's not going to have the capacity for feeling because that's an intangible that I argue is not from the brain. This is an argument also made by Federico Fagin, who had a mystical experience after being a famous inventor. He invented the microprocessor. He was at Intel, like very famous scientist. And then he had a mystical experience, which he's written about. And he's been talking about AI because he's got this very unique background of mystic and hardcore scientist who knows machine learning. He's talked about the same thing, that the machine's not going to become conscious. Now, what I do wonder is, well, we are at some level a physical being, we are material, and we are processing, picking up consciousness, transducing it. It seems that if you created a biological entity and knew how the body is interacting with consciousness, maybe that could be mimicked. I mean, people talk about like clones. Cloning is something that we can do biologically.
Right.
That I would argue, my guess is that they are conscious because they are biological entities that are processing consciousness. Now, I've heard someone, I initially heard it on Skeptico podcast again. Bruce Fenton mentioned this idea. He's like, well, what if a machine could be complex enough as a non-conscious entity to learn how to reverse engineer a biological entity that becomes conscious because it picks it up as an antenna?
Mhm.
Could an AI do that and then make itself that biological entity, which is a really interesting point that I hadn't considered. That to me still is not creating new consciousness. It's picking it up from the outside.
That's interesting because there is a paradox in AI because a lot of the scientists that work within the field, they're convinced that, they're physicalists, they're materialists, right? But that yet they think that AI is somehow conscious or will become conscious. And so that as a philosopher, it forced me into a great thought experiment where I wrote this following paragraph, and I'll just read it real quick here. If materialism, physicalism were causal, why would there be a need to create AI, artificial intelligence, in an effort to imbue matter with consciousness? Wouldn't it have created itself automatically if their theory were true? The need for creating AI communicates to me that their theory is flawed from the start. There is no AI in nature. They create AI because they deny NI, natural intelligence, the existence of consciousness as original intelligence. AI is the bastard child, therefore, of materialistic reductionism and their denial of consciousness as a causative factor. If AI were real and therefore in any sense an intelligence, why didn't it create itself? Technology is based on one thing, nature. And that was a thought that just came to me, that
Wow.
if AI were indeed in any sense of the word intelligent, it should by rights create itself. But what they also don't realize is that their denial of consciousness as a causative factor, their own consciousness created the AI. So there's a disconnect there.
Very well said. That's deep, Matt. Yeah. And it gets to the fundamental paradox and really hypocrisy of materialism, which says we're the side of logic and reason. And yet if you go to the base of materialism, they don't know the origin of, they can't explain the Big Bang. And it's essentially, I forget who said this. They're saying, grant us this one miracle, and then we can explain everything else. But the paradox and the hypocrisy is, well, your whole foundation, your presupposition is some kind of miracle that you can't explain. And this goes back to Kastrup's argument for idealism over materialism of materialism is based on a leap of faith. They make fun of faith, but it is actually a more faith-based system to say that there is this universe that pre-exists consciousness. All consciousness came after matter, and we would never be able to verify it. So it's based on an unverifiable belief system. And I say this in the preface of my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. Albert Einstein was speaking with Tagore, who was a mystic, and they were talking about this very idea of like what's real, is the material real? And Einstein said, who was more of a materialist, more of a reductionist, I cannot prove that my conception is right, but that is my religion. So at least he acknowledged it. He at least acknowledged
Right.
that materialism is a faith-based system, which I wish they would acknowledge that part of it, because they are opposed to faith, but materialism is a faith-based system.
I did a production recently in December called Dispelling Dimensional Madness. And I let Neil deGrasse Tyson basically destroy himself with his own argument about faith. It's a very interesting production, but nonetheless, it really is a religion. Scientism is a belief system, because again, there's certain things that are just diametrically opposed within its own system of belief, which is interesting. And we can pick these things apart and point them out, not to be mean, but to be scientific about it. So in some sense, the outsider is more scientific than the insider is, at least in this day and age. It might reverse itself again, but as a previous podcaster said to me, it's as if academia is just untouchable, like it's
Right.
bulletproof, and nobody knows why, but it just keeps going on and on and on. But it's not the building's fault; it's the minds that inhabit it. And as minds change and progress and evolve, so can the institution. So we don't need to tear buildings down. I like to say that all these wonderful Federal Reserve buildings are very nice architecture. They could be turned into homeless shelters once we move away from fiat currency. But
Yeah.
in other words, yeah. So the evidence that we are not alone. Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Sure.
What
This is
what are your findings?
my fourth book is called An End to Upside Down Contact. So I explore human contact with other intelligences. Is that a real thing? And this was something that I was exposed to very early in my exploration of consciousness, because people were talking about having mystical experiences with beings that were not humans. So a near-death experience is a good example. They say, I encountered a being of light. This is a being I've known throughout the ages. There was a man, Alan Huguenot, in my podcast. He says this on the podcast. from his near-death experience, but this is common. Maybe they encounter someone that they identified as Jesus or the Buddha or other types of spiritual figures. In any event, these are intelligences in a non-physical realm. We see this also with DMT, the psychedelic, and many other psychedelics too. But DMT is a very strong psychedelic, dimethyltryptamine. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico conducted a famous study and wrote a book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and did a documentary with Joe Rogan called DMT, the Spirit Molecule.
Mm-hmm.
But his study was to give people DMT intravenously. Typically, the body, which produces DMT endogenously, it breaks it down. So we're not tripping all the time. But if you inject it intravenously or take ayahuasca, which is a chemical combination that leaves the DMT active, you can have a longer trip. So that's what Rick Strassman did in his intravenous study of DMT. And what he found repeatedly was that people were interacting with beings. He ended up stopping the study, and he writes this in his book. He was like, I wasn't expecting for them to have these interactions with beings. And I think he felt like an ethical concern with it to subject people to this stuff because it was very real to them. Their body was in one place. Their consciousness was somewhere else interacting. Mm-hmm. And this ties in with some of the stuff I get into in the book around UFOs and the UFO phenomenon, which is now in the news, like mainstream Senate hearings about this stuff. John Mack, who was the head of psychiatry at Harvard, Pulitzer Prize winner. So as mainstream as you can be. Late in his career, before he passed away in 2004, he heard about people alleging that they not only encountered non-human intelligences, but they were abducted by them and were put on surgical tables. I know this sounds insane, but it comes up over and over again. So he looked at it and, as a psychiatrist, concluded that these people were not psychotic. He wrote a book called Abduction, where he goes through case studies, like as a meticulous scientist, and then wrote a book called Passport to the Cosmos. And then I'm tying this to Rick Strassman's work because I didn't make the connection until I researched it. Rick Strassman's subjects in the DMT study sometimes reported things that are virtually identical to what people talk about in an alien abduction accusation or allegation. And these were not people who necessarily knew about alien abductions. And Rick Strassman was not familiar with that subject matter. And the people that John Mack was looking at, these were not people who were under DMT. These were just people who, in an everyday experience, had something very strange happen. They had missing time. They can't account for the time. They were actually taken away, either physically or their consciousness was taken. So there's something about, and this ties to consciousness in our earlier discussion, it's all related. There's something about these other dimensions, and we are not alone in that experience. That's my conclusion, where there are intelligences who are interacting with us. We might not notice it unless we get into an altered state, but it seems that if our brain's like an antenna, it can be tapped into by energies that we don't see with our eyes. And my last point on this, Helene Wabe, who's the director of research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, she wrote a book called The Science of Channeling, and it's become very popular. Channeling is the idea that you can tap into an intelligence outside your body and have it speak through you. So she's done research on this, and the Institute of Noetic Sciences had looked at this as well, looking at, like, are these people just psychotic? Do they have multiple personality disorder? And what they find is that people who channel don't meet the criteria for a psychiatric issue. Like, there's something genuinely happening to them. And even they find that when there are random number generator machines in the same room as the person who's allegedly channeling. So a channeler is in a normal state. So I'm just Mark talking. And then I say, okay, Matt, I'm going to channel. I go into some kind of meditative state and something will speak through me. As if I'm not a channeler, but if I were, would speak through me. My cadence would change. The vocabulary might even change, as if the vocal cords are being used. So what they do in the study is they have people get into that channeled state, and they see that these machines that usually generate a random stream of zeros and ones or some random pattern behave non-randomly when the person's channeling, which again suggests that maybe there's an energy. That's a long way of saying that it could be that some people are channeling in a conscious way where it's like, okay, I'm going to open my consciousness up. I'm going to let this being in. Maybe I think that's probably dangerous, but you could do it. Is it happening when we're not even aware of it? Like, is our antenna picking things up where all of a sudden Matt has this creative insight to write this like poetic metaphysical statement? Where does that come from, right? Where does a creative idea come from? It might be that there are other intelligences, other whirlpools, multidimensional whirlpools that we're somehow tapping into.
Right. That's interesting. I went through a phase in 2008, 7, 6, back in those days where I studied some channelers, the Bashars of the world
Mhm.
and others. It's interesting to me, but at the end of the day, I had personal experiences with folks that were into this that weren't very pleasant. So I kind of came away with it with a keep my shields up, and what I think about, interestingly enough, Walter Russell, again, on philosophy.org, if you go to the archives and click on the philosophy articles, he talks about, uh, it's called Letter to Clara Clemens, which was the daughter of Mark Twain. And she lost her husband, Osip Gabrilowitsch, who was the Detroit Symphony conductor and composer. And it was very hard for her. So she knew that he had had these illuminating experiences, and she wrote to him and asked. It's a 19-page letter. It's fascinating, but I wanted to share that with you in the audience, that he talks about what happens after death and how you can communicate with these consciousnesses that have passed on. So I did want to share that, but also that I did interview Mitch Schultz, who was co-director of the Spirit Molecule back
Okay.
in 2011, I think, or
Okay.
2012. And I said something to him that was profound. It was a great documentary, by the way. And I said, what if we experience what it's like to experience, we experience the consciousness of the mushroom, right? When we take it. But what if the mushroom is also experiencing what it's like to be human?
Hmm.
And so that could result in a bad trip if it flips out, right?
Wow. Yeah.
But just a thought. I like to do that, turn things around, walk around them 360.
Matt,
But yeah, that's
can I add something to your comment on channeling? Because you raised a really
certainly
important point. I
sure.
don't want to forget it. Because I also have my guard up around channeling now.
Mhm.
I wrote in my second book, An End Upside Down Living, I have a chapter on cautions. Like, as in, it's not all roses to think about the universe as made of unconditional love, because there is this duality. And I tell the story of a woman who learned to channel, and it seemed like the channeling was helping her, meaning she was connecting with beings that were giving her advice that helped. At one point, they told her she should quit her job, and her instinct was that it was not a good decision. But she said, I'm going to do it anyway. So she listened to them, and it ended up being a horrible decision. And then
Mm.
she said the beings started laughing and told her that she should kill herself.
Wow.
So this goes back to the prior discussion, duality and non-duality. There is dark and light. And I think this goes for the other dimensions too. So when people are channeling, I don't know, we can't see them. So there are many spiritual teachers who say, look, it's hard enough to tell who the good guys are in real life, who are the wolf in sheep's clothing versus the real ones. And then we're dealing with something invisible. There are cautions. So when I talk about channeling now, I feel like I have to give that caveat. There might be some beings who are benevolent and can help us, but there might
Mhm.
also be some ones who are manipulative, and maybe they give you 99% truth, but they might be really smart and clever and just steer you in the wrong direction with that 1%.
That's well said. And, that's what I appreciate about you is not only your books, which I've got to order some, but the fact that you've really looked into all these different fields, not just one, but you're looking at all of this stuff objectively, and then, you know, basically doing a fusion of it in your presentation. And that's important these days. And also speaks to, we've got government technologies as well, as you said, with the CIA and other things that
Mhm.
with the remote viewing, but there's those who think that as well, these microwave or Tetra towers, 5G and stuff like that can also influence human thought. And so it's definitely good to keep your shields up and question, what is it in you that is thinking, is it good for me or not? But I certainly know that from my own experience, there's what the mystic would call the still small voice, which is your conscience. And remember the Jiminy Cricket cartoon, always let your conscience be your guide.
Hmm.
It's that still small voice in you that when you're a young man and you did stupid things, it was whispering, going, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And we don't listen. Next thing you know, we're getting fingerprinted, right?
Right.
Or we wreck the car, or somebody falls off, the wall or whatever. But these are those little experiences that we all have that we can all relate to. But I think it's an exercise in learning to listen to that still small voice, and it will never lie, it will never cheat or steal or direct you to do anything that's not outside of the common good for yourself and for others. And I think that's that unconditional, voice of authority really within you that that can help you to stay on the straight and narrow, if you
Yeah.
will.
Well, the challenge that I've had with that, I totally agree with you, is identifying what's that voice.
Hmm.
Sometimes it can be difficult to discern what is something else that overrides it, that's nudging you in the other direction. And my
Hmm.
process personally has been one of trial and error, where maybe I thought it was that benevolent conscience, but it was something else. And I followed it and it didn't go the way that I wanted. So it's sort of like, okay, now I realize the error I made. It's difficult to describe this because we're dealing with our consciousness. So
Hmm.
it's only you can do it internally. And maybe that is one of the core parts of our individual and collective journeys, is to be able to identify, to know that that voice is there, that inner knowing, and then to know the inner knowing versus something else.
Right. Now, that leads me to this question. Have you personally, Mark Gober, ever had a mystical experience?
I have not had an experience where I say to you, Matt, I lived the oneness like the near death experiencers have, or the DMT subjects have, where they say, I experienced it and I know. My
Mhm.
experiences have been much more subtle. So it started for me as synchronicity in 2016. It was actually one of the most powerful things for me. I mean, I talk about it in my book and End Upside Down Living, but it's only going to be impactful to me because it's hard to describe to other people how powerful it is to experience and encounter something over and over again that's like very random. And when you run the numbers in your own head, how could this be occurring over and over again and having these strange coincidences? That's where it started. Then I've had mystical, what I would call mystical encounters with people who channel, witnessing them in front of me and knowing them, and then seeing the state that they go into and the information that's coming out of them. I'm like, something's happening. I don't know if it's good or bad, but like that is not normal.
Mhm.
That's mystical to actually experience it. And then also having worked with some psychics early on, who knew things about me that no one else knew, or things that they couldn't have known about me because they were on the phone and they couldn't even see me. Like very strange things like that. And then when I left my job in early 2020, I was working part time to like transition out slowly. And I went on some retreats for the first time because previously I was working all the time. I couldn't take like weeks off to meditate. So I went on a few retreats. First, I went on an Ayurvedic panchakarma. It was 5 days of ancient Indian methods of basically purifying the body, and it was
Mhm.
amazing. But it was kind of my prelude to two extended meditation retreats that I went on in the next few weeks. They were nearly a week long, a little under a week long each. Silent, no gesturing at people, no
Wow.
talking,
Mhm.
real intense. So one was with Adyashanti, a well-known spiritual teacher, and then his wife Mukti, who was also excellent, but not quite as famous in terms of name recognition. But I started to feel energies for the first time. Like I felt like a pounding in the middle of the forehead. And I'm like looking around at the statues in the retreat center and I see everyone with like this thing there. And I'm like, that's the third eye everyone's talking about. I think maybe I'm feeling that for the first time. And then
Mhm.
I started to feel energetic, electric sensations in the body, sometimes blissful. And then the closest thing to a real personal mystical experience has happened twice a few years ago, both after retreats, where I was meditating at home and felt this sensation of surrender, where I was sort of in this mindset, not verbalizing it, of just like, I just want to be a vessel. Like I don't need anything from the world anymore. I don't need to be on this treadmill anymore. And not in a verbal way. That was the gesture of my mind. And I felt
Mhm.
this lightness of a sensation that overtook the density of my body. It did not feel like a being, like a third party. It just felt like my body became very light. And it was a level of pleasure that was beyond what I can describe with words and beyond anything I've ever physically experienced by orders of magnitude. And it was very brief and it was so intense both times that I thought I was going to die if I let it continue. So my body literally shut it down. So I wouldn't say that helped me experience the oneness and interconnectivity, but it was a knowing of something that is like really mystical that I experienced, even though it was brief.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's thanks for sharing. I want to cover two more topics with you, and we can mold these into one, but basically problems with the current paradigm of government statism versus an alternative voluntarism, and then the Great Reset and what that entails.
So this is me in both cases trying to apply all the stuff about consciousness to what's going on in the world. And that's what I've done in 2 of the books, An End to Upside Down Liberty and An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is what you were just asking about. So if we take, let's go to the liberty idea first. We've talked about life reviews in near-death experiences where people relive their life. They come back and they say, look, the golden rule built into the fabric of reality, compassion, all that stuff. Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia wrote a book called After, which talks about his years of studies on near-death experiences. And what he finds in talking to person after person is that this notion of a golden rule is actually beyond morality. He says it's natural law based on what people are telling him. So to me, that's interesting because I'm coming at this from the consciousness lens. We've got something that we can empirically talk about that is pointing to an aspect of natural law, that we should treat people the way that we want to be treated because we're interconnected. Okay. That led me to then think about our governmental system, which, I mean, we could talk 5 hours on this, but I'm gonna keep it brief. Basically, because I want to preface this to your audience. I had never thought about this before. This is another paradigm shift in like a totally new way of challenging the way that we're taught about things. Our paradigm in the world, in the United States and elsewhere, I would argue violates the golden rule, is not in accordance with the golden rule, meaning that our society is not spiritually aligned. Even in America, where we've been relatively free compared to other places. I know in the last few years, it's moved in a direction that many of us are concerned about, but relative to other places, I mean, we've had it pretty good. Even though I'm challenging it. So statism is the idea that there should be a compulsory political monopoly that can tell you what to do, even if you didn't agree to it. People might counter that initially. Their first thought would be, well, I consented to it because I live here. And what I would argue, and many others have argued, is that it's an implied consent. It is different than if you hired someone. So let me take a step back. The government is essentially a service provider. It provides legal services, police services, military services, the roads. But there are other service providers in the world too. You could hire a plumber. You could hire a lawyer.
Right.
Anyone else. But the government has these special privileges in servicing with these very specific things. Now, what's the difference between government and a traditional service provider? What happens if your plumber doesn't do a good job? You can fire the plumber. What happens if you need legal services for something very important? You'd probably sign a contract that specifies all the things that the lawyer is going to do for you. What happens if they don't? You could terminate it, what the pricing structure is. And I'm laying this out because government, we don't have that explicit contractual relationship. We don't hire them for these things. It's more implicit. And because of that small distinction, they then can impose things, including morality through laws that they would consider to be appropriate that you didn't necessarily want. Why is that important? To me, that violates the golden rule. And in political terminology, the corollary is the non-aggression principle, which is that we should not initiate any form of aggression against a person's body or the private property that they own. Money, land, computer, anything that they own. Don't initiate aggression on it. And if someone initiates aggression against you, your body and your property, you have a right to self-defense. And to me, this is like, getting into the spiritual world. Apply that non-aggression principle, effectively the golden rule, to politics. If you think about it that way, government violates the non-aggression principle. And aggression doesn't just have to be physical violence. It could be theft, fraud, coercion, extortion. These are things that government can do under the guise fear-mongering. They can do these things, but under the guise of benevolence. So what I'm really challenging is to get more aligned spiritually in terms of our authority figures.
That's well said. Well, if it's consciousness that got us into this mess, then I also see that it's consciousness that can get us out of this mess.
Yes.
So, well, Mark, it's been really great. I really appreciate your time coming on, and I'm looking forward to hosting a panel with you. I'd just like to give you some time and the floor to give us some closing thoughts, and what would you like to impart to the listeners?
Well, first, Matt, I want to thank you so much for having me on, and I appreciate the depth that you went into and hope your audience appreciates what we discussed. These are fundamental topics that you covered, so I just am very grateful that you provided the platform for it. And the notion that we've been getting into toward the end of this conversation of duality, non-duality, I just want to harp on that again as it relates to where we're headed and the notion of compassion with discernment, because a lot of the more authoritarian things that are coming down are veiled as compassionate initiatives that, oh, this is to make society better and we're all one and that's great. And I see some some people and some philosophies that are very spiritual in ways that I would agree with, falling for it and seeing only the surface level of the initiative and saying, oh, well, no, I want to be a spiritual person and I want to be compassionate. And they're saying something that's compassionate and they're not looking at the deeper levels. So what's critical, at least at my stage of development, is to focus not only on the surface level, but to do the analysis of what's beneath the surface and figure out, is it just compassionate on the micro level? Is it also compassionate on the macro level? Because a lot of the stuff politically and socioculturally, you could see where if you just cut out a little box, the little thing they're talking about is compassionate. But if you zoomed out, you'd see all the ways in which it's not compassionate, which is then a violation of basic spiritual principles. So that's what I'm urging myself in saying that, to try to have that mentality, but also trying to hopefully awaken the minds of your audience members as well, to try to keep that in mind, because we can be deceived. And I know I have been deceived. So I'm just very conscious of that.
And before we share your links and what your upcoming projects are, real quick, one more question. From a solution-oriented perspective, what do you think is the ultimate solution to the problems that we find ourselves in when it comes to consciousness?
I think you said it a few minutes ago, a shift in consciousness. When we start to have these awakenings and changes in our paradigms, I think then there's no choice but to live a different kind of a life. They go hand in hand. So it starts with the consciousness shift, and then we start to embody our unique skills and abilities to live in accordance with that new paradigm. So as we individually awaken, then there is a new picture that's painted. I mean, the analogy that I often give is we are unique as individuals, unique puzzle pieces in a cosmic puzzle. So the goal is to recognize what kind of puzzle piece we are, then embody it to the fullest. And that starts with a consciousness shift.
That's wonderfully said. All right, brother. Well, I appreciate it once again. Why don't you give out your links, and I'm going to scroll through your website and just share. We're going to scroll down through your many books here. And again, I think it's wonderful that you're bringing a right side up view to an upside down world. And so just share with us a little on your website, your podcast, how people can get your subscription and so on with your books. And I'll get your books up here on the screen.
Sure. Yeah. Again, my website is markgober.com, markgober.com. I've written 5 books as of now, as of when we're talking in July of 2023. And they are about, the first one, An End to Upside Down Thinking, is about the brain and consciousness. Second one, An End to Upside Down Living, is about living with this new paradigm. Third, An End to Upside Down Liberty, is about the intersection between politics, economics, and spiritual principles. Then An End to Upside Down Contact on non-human intelligence, UFOs, aliens, and spirits. And the most recent one, An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is on the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and why it is dangerous for us. All the books are available on Amazon, hard copy, Kindle, and Audible. I read all the books in the studio, which was a fun experience. But so I'm the narrator of all those. And my podcast series, Where Is My Mind? You can get it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all the major players. Where Is My Mind with Mark Gober, because there are some other podcasts called Where Is My Mind, but Matt has the logo up on the screen so you can see it. I did it with Blue Duck Media. So sometimes that is the, if you search it on various players, Mark Gober and Blue Duck Media. In terms of new projects, I don't know what's next. I mean, it's been this sort of uncomfortable, not sort of, very uncomfortable phase for me to leave my job. Didn't know initially I was going to write a second book. I mean, I thought I was done after one, and a podcast series. I said, this is important stuff, I'm done. But it's the evolution's unfolded for me, and then I always feel this desire to share. So I don't know if that's going to happen again with the book or some content. I really enjoy and appreciate conversations like this, the opportunity to do this. So I probably will do that to the extent the opportunities come up. But I don't know. I mean, it goes back to your question, Matt, of how's the world going to change? It starts with a consciousness shift, but then there is action that comes with it. And I don't know for myself exactly how that's going to manifest.
I appreciate that. And I think it all starts with each individual making that choice. You know, that's true free will. You can do as thou wilt, as it's been said, but you know, the tail follows you around. So make it a good one, make that character great. And it reminds me of a saying that I just wanted to say too, from Larkin Rose. When enough people understand reality, tyrants can literally be ignored out of existence. I think that's a wonderful way to wrap the show. And thank you so much, Mark. And guys, do support Mark's work. Go get some books, order a book from him. Since he's in between things, it's good to support people that are doing this, especially people that come out not necessarily against academia, but with a 180-degree view that's different from what they were taught. And it takes a lot of bravery these days for academicians to come out and then focus that telescope back in on that institution, question its, ideals, and, try to make massive paradigm shifts. These aren't easy tasks, and it takes a lot of courage to do so. So we appreciate you. My listeners will order some of your books, and we'll have you back in a month or so. And if you could just hang on through the end, because I'd like to give you a gift at the end of this. I'd like to send a book to you from the University of Science and Philosophy, Dr. Walter Russell, and you pick the book and I'll get it over to you. But again, thanks for coming on so much, and look forward to having you back on with the panel in a month or so.
Wow. Thank you so much, Matt.
All right, great. And thank you to the audience. You guys are great. Appreciate the support. Just continue to share the podcast as you see fit, and we hope to see you on the next one. Take care, everybody. Talk to you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for viewing and for sharing the link to this tech podcast. To find out more about the work that I do, you can visit mattpresti.com. Scroll down to the bottom to view all of my social media links and channels. If you feel so inclined, you may leave a donation through the Cash App by scanning the QR code or using the hashtag $MPRESTI. To contact me, simply reach out through the contact form at mattpresti.com. Thank you so much.